All right, so going back to what I was talking about just now, right? So, um, as I was trying to figure out the idea to design this character that's supposed to be the main antagonist for our Raven Knight, um, whenever you design a character, especially a villain, it should go against everything that your main character is. That way, at least from a visual standpoint, it's very easy to understand that it's against your character because visually it's also against your character. So try and come up with a story helps out, even if you don't actually tell the story. But as you're designing, it's good to have one. So initially, I thought like this reference was really cool. I don't know what happened to this poor cat, but it reminds me of the Uruk-hai in Lord of the Rings, which I thought was very nice. But one thing I want to try and play with is like the concept of that he's a hairless cat. So that's why this cat is extremely jealous of birds because the feathers are really pretty. And I want to play with that simple storyline. Obviously, cats eat birds, but on top of that, they're jealous of the fur as well. So starting off with a very simple human emotion helps out your design much, much more, right? So our main character, which is the Raven, where is he? So his main motivation is revenge, right? Revenge, and of course to see his loved ones again. So again, even though it's a fictional character, but the human emotion is very real. So everything that I designed about him, I should focus on revenge and the fact that he loves his wife, right? So what I need to focus on for this character instead is maybe jealousy and pride as kind of like a strong keywords of how I want to design him. So I'm also going to mix in some kind of element of armor and clothing. Um, I am thinking of like a Japanese Oni demon or white, like a white armor demon or samurai, whatever. Not saying some Japanese samurais are bad, but it's just I think it'll make like a nice shape language against our human, oh sorry, our Raven character. So I have some nice 3D references here, which I think would be great for textures and things like this. One is really cool because it's already the shape of a cat. Um, so yeah, let's start. I am not using this reference. I mean, I love the Adam Driver cat comparison pictures; they're excellent. But um, to me, Kylo Ren, like I think Adam Driver is a very good character for Kylo Ren because he is specifically a conflicted villain. So in some sense, he is supposed to turn into a good guy at some point. Like I'm sure episode 9 they're gonna settle it, I suppose, right? Um, so they needed to find an actor that could both look evil but also good. So that's why you have this poor tormented look on him, right? Um, we are designing something more along the lines of Snoke in that respect, where it's more of a direct villain, just to make our lives a little bit easier. Because conflicted characters by default actually require a little bit more in-depth psychological study before we design. Okay, so I love this reference. I love the reference with the one of the red eyes. This is excellent. So this is very useful. Like the expression is perfect. So, oh no, 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 don't do it. But yeah, but the expression is great. So I'm gonna stick with that and pop in some armor. This I might use this for the camera angle, the angle of the head. I think it's very good, but we might take this pose and then swap it with this skin, and we'll see how that works. So let's begin sketching. So I have my character on the side here just to kind of have a sense of where I belong at the moment. I'm going to focus a lot on the face this time. For our Raven Knight, a lot of the focus was just the overall gesture and the armor. But this time, it's gonna be quite a bit on the face of the cat. So my kind of like mantra for drawing is kind of draw it out first and then be as quick as you can, and give yourself a chance to correct your drawing after you drawn it out. Like try not to like draw and erase, draw and erase, draw and erase. I do think that you should just move quickly, just kind of let some accidents happen and test it out first. It's very easy to kind of liquefy or distort the drawing later anyway. So another rule of thumb is like if you want to make your character look bigger and older, scale down the eyes. It automatically makes them look larger. And also, if the eyes are closer together like this, they tend to look more villainous and kind of like super focused. You can also try like wider apart and see how that looks. It sometimes gives off like a different feeling. Snakes are good examples of a slightly wider, and they give off like quite a different vibe. And that's not too bad, we might keep that. I also want to tie back with my story a little bit better. Remember with the teeth sinking through his skull, so I want to try and suggest like just one of his fangs is larger than the other. So I'm spending quite a bit of time on the head here because then I'm kind of like mudding around a little bit. Because like I mentioned just now, I think the head is going to play a big role, more so than the rest of the body. So I'm kind of liking this direction, and I want to stress on the word kind of, because I need to see in the context of the rest of the costume first before I can really decide. So I'm just going to quickly block out some kind of outfit. And I want to do like a quite a different version of his armor again. So they both should wear armor, but I want them to look fairly different. So I'm going to give him like a little bit more of a layered samurai armor instead, and a little bit looser clothing. So it's a mix of a Ronin samurai plated armor kind of a look. And see, I'm kind of constantly scaling it down because I'm running out of space. Because this character is relatively tall, so it's gonna take up quite a bit of room. Testing out like the little cat legs. Let's see if that works on this character. I think that looks a little bit overly done. Let's try something else. Oh, I should save. Last time it crashed somewhere along this time, so just save this really quickly. I'm bouncing in between the name of White Fang, White Claw, something like that. Not sure yet. We'll figure it out. So the reason why I say like I like to draw it out quickly, because it gives me a chance to see where I think potential mistakes of the design or lack of quality in the design is. So right now, like looking at it, I think he looks a little bit weird, like his neck is too long for his body. So I'm gonna just do another version and let's try and make him taller, right? So I like the idea of that I can sketch something without much consequence, so I can be very free, can have a lot of fun. But then at a certain point, after you've played around a little bit, you should change hats and then just start to think like more from a client or an art director's perspective and try to find errors in your drawing. And you should be bouncing between these two hats quite often, right? So the first hat is artist. So artist can be very fun, very happy, can be like very exciting, but then you have to change to like a art director hat and you have to be more serious and a little bit more critical, right? Because you want to art direct and find flaws in your design. So if you always are wearing the artist hat, then what will happen very likely is that your designs might get nowhere because you're just constantly developing ideas but not really having any results. Or you might get some errors in your design that you could have easily sorted out early on. If you're mainly on the art director side, the other issue is that your designs might be boring, right? Or they might be too safe. You don't get a chance to really explore a crazy idea. So balancing between the two will be the best, right? Some of us are more here, some of you are more here. It depends on your personality. It's just important to know where you are at which point, and then kind of know when to switch on and switch off those hats. I'm sure like now that you're all working with your teammates, you might even know like which one of your teammates is more of an artist hat or which one is a art director hat. And that's really good info to know. So kind of digging where this is going, I'm imagining this story or game to be like a Dark Souls with pigeons and cats, ravens and cats kind of a vibe. So I'm making sure that each character has a combat style or like a way that they can move. So I'm trying to suggest that this guy is way more agile than the Raven Knight. The Raven Knight was never really meant to fight, so that's why he wears a lot of armor, but this White Fang is way better at what he does. And if you compare it to our previous design, you can kind of see like he looks a bit silly now. It's really short and weird in the first version, so I'm glad that we tried out a different proportion. But I'm gonna go one more pass and see if I can try out some even more crazy ideas with the hands. Right, so let's just try for a second if the hands are small. Yeah, it's not gonna work. I like kind of like testing out like an extreme just to see where I can go. Oh, I like that though. I think this is pretty cool. Like really orangutan kind of length arms. Yeah, this is badass. So another thing I really wanted to play around was like the there is this trope in Star Wars where bounty hunters, like let's say Boba Fett, after he kills a Jedi, he'll keep the lightsaber. I think they did that for the Wookiee braids as well. the Chewbacca's, you know, his relatives' braids. It's like a trophy, right? So I'm wondering if I could have a portion of his outfits made out of feathers from all of the kinds of birds that he's like slaughtered in his time. We might keep it to just raven, so it's going to be a bluish, so it's going to be blue, gray here, going to be white armor, white skin, that kind of a thing. So let's see where that goes. All right, but I think this is a working design. We have a pretty decent head, pretty decent outfit. Let me try really quickly. You know what? Yeah, I think this could work actually. Just need to scale the head down, I think. Yeah. I think it's a little bit more bolder, you know, a little bit braver. So I think that's good. Considering our Raven Knight is pretty stylized, I did feel like the initial version of this sketch was relatively safe, so. But this is how I like to play with stylization anyway. I'll draw it out and then only kind of mess around with it and see where I can go. So you have one option here. This was a pretty close second, right? And this was the very first one. Yeah. So you can kind of see like how it's evolving, and to me, like my design process is kind of like that. The idea is the same, right? Like the recurring theme of the cat, the summer, is consistent, right? Because that has always been my design idea, but there's a lot more problem solving in between, and I tend to even do this down to the coloring stage. I might make tweaks down the road, but this is kind of like going back to how like your first drawing tends to be the worst out of the set because it hasn't got a chance to be art directed by yourself yet, right? So this is pretty decent. So let's start quickly rendering this out. Okay, so I like to paint with a flat color technique first. So what I tend to do is just kind of lasso the big shape that makes up the one major color, right? I'll have my color swatches ready. Those usually tend to be just the pictures that I got it from. So I do want him to be like a pale gray, cool gray kind of vibe. And the idea is to try and stick to a very light middle tone. So middle tone is the color in between the highlight and the shadows. His remaining armor is very likely gonna be that like all white as well. I haven't decided yet what the motifs would be, but let's just kind of block it in. So middle tone for white will be somewhere around here. And this is honestly quite a challenging piece to paint because whites are normally not fun to paint most of the time. So we'll see if this painting survives. And I'm thinking of some kind of desaturated blue-gray for the shirt. Because my thought process is like, this is a jealous bird. This is a jealous cat, sorry. So jealousy means that you want to be something that you can't be, right? So he's essentially a cat that secretly wants to be a raven, right? That's why he's so angry at them. So, but he thinks he's above Raven, so that's why he's pure and white. But deep down, he wants to be black. Which is, I think, is a social commentary for other things in life as well. But anyway, so I would like to kind of start out like that. Very simple, flat colors, and just, I don't think too much during this phase. It's just kind of like I try and select something right away. And now I can actually start to add some values to it. So before that, let me just change this to layer bounds. I like to set my layer panel to layer bounds instead, and then quite a large one so that I can, you know, really see what my layer is, right? So this is quite useful if you paint with a lot of layers. I will put on my layer lock and save, and then we can start painting. Okay, so the way I like to settle my lighting is I imagine that my light is falling down like rain. So imagine that the sky is raining paint. So the rain is gonna fall and gonna touch all of the areas at the top, right? Like how the top of your head gets more wet than the bottom of your jaw, for example, right? This is how I view lighting in my works. So I use a lasso because I want to get that very nice angular form. And I'm just gonna cut out a section that I think would have the most amount of light. So lasso normally will give you a very hard cut like that, which is not always good. So I'm going to use Shift F6 and feather my selection. Feather about 5 pixels, and then now we should get a softer selection. So I'm also going to mix in a little bit of like dodge tool and just kind of paint in a little bit more different hotspots. So I'll repeat this process until I feel like my portrait is successfully sculpted, like in a way that it looks like it has 3D form. And you can do this with paint. It's just a preference of mine to use lasso because I like to actually select the big shape. It's actually very similar to how like anime cell shading works. It's just that you are maybe using a softer brush instead. Now I can work on my shadows. So the ears are going to get quite a bit of shadow. The eyes especially. The nose. The lip, bottom of the lips. And then portions, the whole kind of bottom section of this is going to get a very nice drop shadow like that. So this takes a little bit of experience projecting light and shadow, and it might take you a few tries if you don't do this often. But when you paint like this, your paintings become a little bit more confident looking because you know exactly where your light and shadow is. So it's definitely worthwhile kind of practicing in this kind of painting instead. So Shift F6, and then we're gonna add like a darker value. Not too much because I need to remember that the cat is still white in color, so I can't really go too dark just yet. Alright, but you can kind of start to see like the face is being sculpted now. So you notice like the ears tend to be pink in color, and also we want to do something like what we call subsurface scattering, which is basically what happens when light goes through a thin skin colored material. You get to see the light shining through. So I definitely want to get that effect on this guy. So I'm going to start with just a medium tone first. Let's not push it too far. And if you notice, like the intensity of the orange is stronger in the middle, where the meat, I suppose, is thinner. But I think on the cat, it's actually around here, the middle edge where it's thinner. So just gonna try and suggest that. And I'm not too worried about color specifically yet. I mean, I am color picking, but I'm not too concerned about, like, you know, questions like is the color too saturated? At least not yet, because I can easily desaturate it. What I'm hoping to achieve now is just to kind of like simulate that look of very, very soft, translucent skin. And I really like how there's that very strong white rim. I'm just gonna paint that in. Okay, and if I want to crank it up, I can just use a dodge tool and just crank it up a little bit. And if I think like the pink is too pink, I can just kind of tone it down, desaturate it a little bit. And let's kind of keep it somewhere here first, so I don't want to over detail it just yet. So I love the eye color on these references. Not sure which one I'm going to go for yet, but let's try it out. So you also notice that I'm not really concerned about like fur, whether it's fur or whether it's skin, because right now my focus is all about trying to capture the 3D form. That's what is most important to me at the moment, that it looks like a sculpted cat's head. And another good reference to study when you're kind of painting is to look at sculptures instead. Because sometimes studying a real cat photo might be a bit challenging to understand because it's too complex with all the fur and everything. Try to look at a sculpture of a cat instead and see how the sculptor simplified the forms, right? Because painting is essentially simplified form that you gradually make more and more complex depending on how finished you want the piece to look like. So I think I want to suggest just a little bit of pinkness on the nose. I'm going to use the overlay and just kind of pink up the mouth a little bit. And let's do the eyes. I'm going to use a new layer for the eyes because I think I'm going to be playing around with that quite a bit. Oh yeah. that is looking interesting. Let's try and scale it down, see if it makes any difference. This is why like that little pre-planning of making the eyes a separate layer could help. Pretty interesting. Kind of like the slightly smaller one. Let's play around with the colors instead. This is more red, orange. Let's try something a little bit more yellow. Yellow orange, I think it's like visually a little bit more easy to read, I think. So let's stick with this first. And like I mentioned before, you can change it anytime with a digital illustration. So let's not dwell too far on it and just kind of move on. There's these little wrinkles on the forehead, and let's see if we can kind of get that. All right, but we're like about, I think, in terms of painting, like actual rendering, I think we're only about like 10 minutes in. So, but we have a pretty decent base of a head. And I think I'm kind of ready to move on to the rest of his body. So just add a little bit more light around the sides here, the light bleed coming from the backlight. Just gonna paint in the backlight rim a little bit more. I kind of really want to try and suggest that platinum blonde cat look. I forgot his little fang, so let's just put that in. The fang will be a new layer as well because I might want to play with it. So medium tone. Teeth are normally brown yellow, not white. So I'm going to stick with like a neutral warm gray. And I did paint this on a separate layer to kind of make my life a little bit easier because I know I'm going to change the values for this quite a bit as well. So anytime you add something, update the drop shadow so that the new object kind of fits in place. So middle tone shadows, and then final is just a little bit of highlight. For the other teeth, smaller, I'm going to use a stamp tool, another trick that I use a lot. So stamp tool, I'm going to flip it so that it gets the opposite image, and then I'm going to scale it by about, because it's half the size, right? So scale it 50% and just plonk it there. You could technically just cut and paste, but this is also another quick way of doing it. Okay, the teeth is way too contrast, so let's lighten it a little bit. Sometimes teeth is borderline translucent depending on the size of the animal, so I think if you make it too opaque, it starts to look a bit fake. And then I think what's missing is just that little black lip that this reference have. I love that little black lip there, so I'm just gonna add that in. And just little teeth. It's nice, like if your character looks like, you know, they're just about to finish just about to start a sentence. I think that will look pretty cool because it doesn't look so static. Okay, so let's move on to the armor then. we have our head roughly done, and get rid of this. And now we're going to try a little bit like, I'm going to start with some base values first. So same thing, start with the shadow. I love starting with the shadow tones first for like harder, more opaque surfaces. So we just start with the shadow like that. I'm going to do a very harsh shadow because this is armor, so it's very opaque. It's not translucent at all, right? So the shadows can be quite dark. Here's also another peeve of mine, like make sure you complete the cylinder shape. It really makes a difference. So I'm keeping the forms fairly simple. It's just a cylindrical shape, but I'm making sure that every part of it is reading correctly. So if you have thickness, please suggest the thickness as well as you can. So this is kind of building up the 3D forms first before we start applying any texture. What I noticed with photo bashes that maybe aren't that successful is that maybe you started photo bashing a little bit too early. So there's no proper base for you to begin yet. And that kind of creates problems down the road, because your photo might very likely look out of place or out of perspective. And worst of all, the lighting won't be consistent. Okay, so let's bring in our photo textures for the armor. I really like this 3D render. It's actually like a futuristic kendo helmet, but I like what this artist did with the treatment of the white plastic or the white painted metal look. So I just want a little bit of that noise onto my design. And for something that's stylized like this, I tend to really only use textures for some subtle noise as opposed to really the whole design, right? So the layer lock helps, so that's why it's nice to have a separate layer for each part. And just gonna warp this object in, this texture in, so that it looks like it fits the same perspective as my painting. And there's a little bit too much shadow, so I'm just gonna tone it down. And we'll test out a few blending modes, maybe soft light, pretty nice, soft light. Overlays, hard light's great. This is nice, this is excellent. Right, actually a lot of my work is done here just through that photo. So that's great. That normally doesn't happen, but that's great. So I'm gonna flip it on the other side so that we quickly get both shoulders done. And the key is to warp it to make sure like the perspective is aligned. And I want to reduce the brightness here, so just going to darken this a little bit. But I kind of like how there is actually a lighter tone in there because I think it looks more realistic. So I'm just going to darken it a little bit and fix some of the values here. So the values here shouldn't be that dark, so just using a lasso and darkening this overall part. Okay, so let's repeat the same process for the chest armor. gonna set up the base tone. So most of the chest is actually in shadow because it's quite low in terms of how far the light can travel, and it's also quite flat. So a lot of the light is just gonna gradiate downwards. And I do want to keep the sculpting of the armor very minimalist because also due to the time that we have, it's quite limited. So let's just keep it fairly simple design. The lasso is a little bit lame, so let's clean it up. Whoops. And I like to just spruce up a few key areas, just get a little bit of light there. So this like just little confident pools of light, just to show like you kind of know what you're doing. Okay, let's see if we can reuse the same texture because I think this is already a very nice material. But what we'll do different this time is that we're gonna flip it on both sides, so you get a mirrored texture instead. And if any of you have gone through like Kobe's class from design process principles, then you should be very familiar with this technique. So I'm going to use a smudge tool to just kind of blur out this middle bit because I don't want that seam there. And I also forgot to mention one thing, that a lot of times photo textures tend to be pixelated after you play with it a little bit too much, and it's not nice to kind of keep that pixelation in your canvas. So an easy thing to do to solve that is to use a blur and then surface blur, and you can play around with the settings. A low threshold is great because it'll keep most of the big details, but it will blur out any small imperfections. So you get something that looks a little bit more graphic, which is excellent for a painted piece of concept art. So I'm going to merge this texture down and then start to refine the lighting. So I really want this white armor to pop. So I want to shine here, but what I'm doing is I'm going to use a magic wand instead. And the magic wand is great because it also picks up like this slight, it avoids some of the slight imperfections in the values, like this edge here, right? So all of this gold trim is unaffected, and what I can do now is just use my dodge tool and just go over that once and get me like a really nice shine. Okay, values here are getting a little bit too dark. I'm going to lighten that up. Okay, so let's add a little bit more brush stroke on the armor because it's looking a little bit flat. So I'm just going in with a texture brush and just kind of offsetting some of the more mechanical strokes from the dodge, because the dodge tool is great to set values, but it does give off a very airbrushed look, which doesn't always look nice. So I think a more textured brush like this should give us a handcrafted look. I'm also thinking of keeping these gold bits. I do like this little trim detail, and I might emphasize this a little bit more. And I noticed that it's missing on this side, so let's bring it back in. Okay, and then let's just add back the segment armor here. Okay, moving on forward, now to the body. We're gonna add all of the drop shadows. So now the armor pieces look floating because they are not sitting correctly in terms of shadow yet, right? Let me just clean this up. So what we need to do is figure out where the shadow is gonna drop. So the shoulder armor is gonna cast a really long shadow. The head is already casting a shadow. This shoulder armor will also cast a long shadow here. And this chest armor and groin armor is going to cast a shadow here as well, along with the own self-shadowing for this pants legs part. So I'm just going to select all of these sections, Shift F6, give it a slightly larger filter radius, and then let's just darken this value. And we're going to manually darken the rest using a dodge tool. Let's clean up this neck. I want a nice clean cut here. So the silhouettes of the actual cuts on the different objects is really important. So I'm gonna just add I'm not sure what you call this, but it's like that little trim that you find on the Japanese outfit. And just gonna use my chalky brush and gonna add in some value changes. A little bit of soft shadowing in between the neck and the outfit, and a little bit more light here. Silhouette is a little bit choppy, so let's clean that up. So cat armor coming along. I'm gonna move on to the sleeves, just do it really quickly and fill this up with a hole. Due to the time constraint, I might not even paint the hands and just have the swords coming out. We'll see how I can quickly squeeze that in. But we are kind of almost going into like the 45-minute mark in terms of rendering. So I'm going to try and speed up a little bit here. But most of the hard parts are settled. Now we're kind of just rendering everything else. So the feathers, what I'll do is I'll just select the feathers at the top first, because these are the ones that are gonna get hit by more light. And I'll take my chalky brush, really low opacity, and just kind of hit it with a little bit more light and color. And I'm making use of that chalky textures to just offset the detail a little bit, because if my brush is a little bit noisier, it will kind of suggest that there's more detail on the feather when really there isn't any. So just kind of using the lasso and creating some nice silhouettes of individual feathers. Randomize the order a little bit so it looks more realistic. And for the bottom part, we're just going to focus on the shadowed feathers instead. Oh, let me switch on my layer lock. So you're not supposed to actually paint every single feather, but you're supposed to just indicate the volume and the size there. So it's a little bit hard to see here, but if I just tone down the background color, you can see much clearer the contrast that I'm talking about. Okay, and let's adjust the contrast here a little bit as well so it becomes more visible. I'm gonna add the feet. And just gonna paint in some values. I'm gonna keep it very low value here because even though his skin is white, the whole bottom part here is under shadow, so I don't really want to crank up the colors or the values too much. Probably most of the lighter tones you see are just kind of rim light coming from the back. And I do want to add a little bit of pinkness, so I'm going to set it to, let's see, maybe soft light. Just add a little bit of toning there. Sculpt the toes a bit more. Gonna plot out the blades. Oops. Huh. Make selection. Okay. I'm also just gonna render this once and then flip it on the other side. So set my highlights. This is a highly inaccurate katana blade, but as long as it looks sharp and like metal, I think we should be good. And for the bottom, there is a shadow, but because the blade is also going to reflect the bounce light from the floor, so I'm going to keep that as well. And I was sharing this trick in the last demo where I'm actually going to mix in some colors into the blade itself, and just kind of gives it a little bit more, it'll makes it more beautiful in terms of a painting. And also using a brush instead, kind of offset some of these reflections. So if you notice, like something I'm trying to suggest between these two characters is that this white Fang is like his equipment is very shiny and clean, whereas our main character's equipment is a little bit old and craggly. So it's kind of like that classic contrast thing. Let's give that a little bit more contrast so that it pops a bit more. Flip it on the other side. Shouldn't be an issue for this guy because it should be symmetrical. But what I can do is just adjust the values a little bit so it's not too similar. And I think the drop shadow for this is a little bit more. Okay, we're almost there. I think what's left is really just fine-tuning. So I think the feet gesture can be improved, and this is what I mean, like I'll keep tweaking the painting all the way through. As long as I see a place to improve it, I'll try. Fix the lighting a little bit here. Let's give it more like a V shape instead. So I think it'll do us quite some benefit to make the armor just a little bit more angular, less rounded. Okay, now let's do bounce light, right? So first off, I'm going to set my main light. So the light's coming down, and we've established that just now. So the light's going to come down, and it's going to hit the floor. So let's add some light to the floor. And then let's create a cast shadow. So I learned this trick from Aaron Beck. I watched one of his tutorials, and he did this very clever technique of drawing cast shadows. So what you do is like you imagine that you're looking at your character from the top view, right? Purely from the top. And you just kind of do a very rough representation of how the character looks like from the top. And he has his big shadows, big shoulders, sorry. The arms are sticking out slightly. And then you have the blade. The blade is coming out maybe about this much, let's say. And do your best to kind of just get it as close as you can. And I think he has like two big round feet, which you can't really see. And so this is roughly a top view representation of what the shadow would be. And then we fill this with black. And we'll use this to warp along our picture. You can do this with cars or aeroplanes, even like it almost works pretty well for everything. There's a little bit of finessing involved, like now I need to kind of reposition, and I think I painted the swords a little bit too long, shadow-wise. But it gives you a really nice base to start projecting your shadows. Okay, so I'm going to set this to multiply. I'm going to add a motion blur. And the reason why I use multiply is because when I lighten it, I'll use a lightness instead of opacity, because I think it gives me a nicer result. So I'll lighten it up to this point, and then I would use a dodge tool, a dodge and burn tool, and then just burn in the bottom shadow or the softer shadows. And this to me is like more intuitive than, let's say, erasing or painting it by hand. I noticed the outcome wasn't as good. Okay, we can actually hide our sketch now. Let's enhance the mood. I like to do the darker background towards the end, because I want to focus more on the medium tones during the early stages. But now that the painting is more developed, I can actually start doing this. And set this to overlay, and then maybe just put a little bit of darker values here as well. So what I need to do now is just to maybe recorrect a lot of the values, because maybe like the feet here is just a little bit too bright. The pants, I think, could use a little bit more contrast. And one thing I wanted to show you is also the effect of bounce light, right? So light is coming down here and it's going to hit back to the top. So some of these bottom feathers is actually going to receive some bounce light from the floor. And this is a good this is a good tip to apply, because let's say if your ground is red in color or yellow in color, it's actually going to bounce back a red or yellow color light. So since our ground here is gray, I'm going to bounce a gray color instead. You know what, let me redo this. I'll show you something different. Yep, there we go, this is better. So the bounce light is going to affect this guy. It's also going to affect the feet. So you're going to get just a little bit of bounce here. And it's also going to affect the swords. And because these are metal is effectively a mirror, is actually going to affect the bounce light quite a bit. They're going to reflect a lot of that light. Looks a bit strange now. I just need to clean up my mask. Okay, so last bit is the bounce light on the outfit here. So it's going to tint this blue a little bit. The bounce light will really make your painting get grounded into you make your character look grounded into your painting more like. And you can't really see it now because everything is gray, but let's say if in a different scenario where the ground is actually a different color, like red. So let's say we're using a red ground. Now our character looks really out of place because it's not, there's no light reacting to it. But if we colorize our bounce light, it helps quite a bit more now because you actually see the red color bouncing off of it. And this is why I mean like the bounce light is very important to integrate it into your scene. Okay, last bit of balancing and then we can call it a day. I like to do this balancing towards the end because I can only balance my painting once I have the full lighting built up. Without my lighting, I can't really find a good way to justify how the lighting should be or the value should be affected. So this is something that you can do after you figure out like what your lighting scenario is going to be. So we definitely don't need so much light here. I'm going to tone everything down. And you can kind of see like how the shirt is settled in much better. So final thing is let's add some patterns. I'll show you a quick way to do it. So let's just create a very quick pattern that wraps around the cloth. I'm going to draw it by hand. You can technically download a pattern and wrap around it to get maybe a better result. But for this guy, I think this should work fine. This is kind of merely just a template. So I'm going to save this and Control Select and duplicate from your base. So now this is on a separate pre-cut out layer. Yeah. Now I can colorize it. I can make it lighter tone, darker tone. We can suggest maybe something like this. And what I'll do is I'll play around with a few color schemes. So I think we'll go something a little bit more subtle. And then let's try out maybe that this section is actually reflective instead. And just to give another extra dimension to this part of the cloth. Bit too much, just tone it down. And lastly, let's drop the values for this. This is so that we just get a better variety of tones. almost there. Filter, lens correction. Let's add a vignette. Darken the edges a little bit. This is always good practice to do a final bit of color correction at the end. So I also like to add the lens correction, chromatic aberration. I think it's still nice to kind of put that in. It does offset the colors a little bit, kind of makes it look more real, if that's the look that you're going for. And then another good thing is like image adjustments. It's worth checking out the auto tone. That looks nice. Auto contrast, auto color. It did balance it out a little bit. You can kind of see like the contrast is a little bit more bumped up. And this is just Photoshop's attempt to try and balance everything out. And sometimes it does recommend some pretty good ideas. So last bit of touches, I'm just gonna add the bloom with the dodge tool because the armor is like really white. So it technically is gonna just bounce a lot of light and give out this very nice shine. So that last bit of finessing, I think, kind of brings this whole piece to life. Okay, so we have our character done. Like I said, white armor is a bit tricky. I might want to play with the plastic parts a little bit more. And if we compare side by side to our other character, so this is about a good 1 hour work, and you kind of see like they are both fleshed out to a point where you can get feedback for it, right? They are both very rough, but they are kind of complete in the sense that if you're looking at it from a distance, you can see everything that you're supposed to see with respect to materials and color. And this is great for getting some feedback early on. Then after you're happy with this, then you can arrange time by yourself to figure out how much more detail do you want to add on based on the budget and the time that you have, right? So this is how I work fast. I color by sections. I focus on lighting and material more than anything else. And I keep it relatively simple in the first stages, right? The lighting is actually only one light. If you notice, for both artworks, I don't play around with a lot of kick lights or rim lights or things like that. Try to master one light first. It'll do you much better. Okay.